They are all well welcome to our show tonight. This Sunday is a very interesting show talk that we're going to have, as we have a guest, especially from Israel, from Ben Gurion University, that he's very well known for his views and his publications on Israeli society, on Israeli ambitions in Levant, and also on the Iranian foreign policy. Himself, he speaks fluent, of course, Hebrew, Persian, and Arabic, and he's able also to tell us and guide us on the current events of the changes, of the governmental changes in Israel, and of course the Palestinian issue. We're very pleased tonight to have with us Professor Hagai Ram, directly from Israel. Welcome to our show, Professor Ram. I think I can call you Hagai. I have this permission.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Paulina.
So actually, you are very well known about your views on Iranian foreign policy and Israeli foreign policy. So I think that our people here in Greece and globally that are watching our show, they will going to be very happy to have your views and of course to have an open discussion about these topics.
Absolutely. Let's party.
So with us is also Alexis Lekakis. Alexis is a PhD candidate at Pantheon University in Athens, and he specialized in Iranian foreign policy. We are very well known with Alexis because we keep some shows on Iranian foreign policy. And actually, we have predicted even the results of the elections, Alexis, in February, correct?
Yeah, correct. But that was not so difficult, though. We have to admit that. Thank you for having me here, Paulina. Thank you very much.
Professor Ram, we're going to start from the easy stuff. How is the situation in Israel currently, and what are the changes that the Naftali's government is bringing us the last weeks?
You're talking about Naftali Bennett, right?
Exactly, yes.
Absolutely. Well, you know, in many ways, it's change in semantics, change in scenario, because perhaps the mood, perhaps the policy, perhaps the declarations will be less inflammatory in comparison to Bibi Netanyahu's Likud government. But the people now heading the state of Israel are just as hawkish with respect to the Arab-Palestinian conflict. They may perhaps frame their rhetoric and policy in gentler, more, let's call it civil terms, but they are just as hawkish as the previous government in the sense that there's really no more than a semantic difference between their vision of where Israel is situated and where Israel is heading to in the Middle East. So both the previous government and the current government are not too keen on the two-state solution, which again, some may oppose it on several grounds, but it is no longer an option. The Likud government has put a decisive end to that. But again, as I said, the current government perhaps more gentle, perhaps it has public relations, it will have better public relations with the international arena. They may perhaps ease the inflammatory reality that has beset Israel in the last 9 years. But I really don't see any change in policy. By the way, also vis-a-vis Iran, which I assume will be a topic of later on as we speak.
Hagai, the reason that Netanyahu left the office, it was the signature of the Abraham Accords and his, let's say, anti-Arabic past.
I'm sorry,
I mean, what was the reason that Netanyahu, let's say he's been fired from office and he left after so many years in governance. Why at this period Netanyahu left and Naftali, he joined the government?
Well, the reasons was exactly what I said. I mean, people have been fed up, many people I wish I could say a great majority of the people, but there were enough people who were fed up with his inflammatory rhetoric, with his divide and rule policy, and no less, lest we forget that Bibi Netanyahu is now on trial for several corruption charges, which were not taken lightly by the constituency. And also, again, after 9 years in power, he has been showing, how should I put it, monarchical inclinations, in the sense that he saw himself and many others who supported him as the sole leader of the state of Israel, without whom Israel will be destroyed. And so you have this combination, again, of his inflammatory policy, divide and rule between Jews and between Arabs and Jews. And you have the corruption charges that he's now being put on trial for. And again, his implicit, some more explicit, I would say, authoritarian tendencies, which many people feared. And I think this combination has brought forth this opportunity to replace him, and therefore you have this coalition government, which is in itself is rather contradictory. Parts of it are, left wing in a sense, Zionist left wing, if you can call Zionists leftists. Some of them are right wings, and of course, for the first time in Israeli history, you have an Arab party, which is part of the coalition, and this Arab party is very much a central mechanism which will determine whether or not this government will survive.
I mean, how come Ram joined this government?
Well, this is a very interesting affair. The Ram party, which of course officially is an Islamist party, but it was, again, it has to do with internal rifts within the Arab political system in Israel, on the one hand, and on the other hand, I think what we had is a very courageous, I must admit, a very courageous step by the Ram party to actually not just talk the talk, but also walk the walk, in the sense that this is really a historic moment where the leader of the party has, in many ways, come to the awareness that perhaps this is the first time that an Arab party can influence Israeli politics from the inside. And what also facilitated the entrance of the Ram party into the coalition was that, in many ways, Bibi Netanyahu had sought his support in order to create a coalition government before Naftali Bennett had approached him. So in many ways, Bibi Netanyahu had given a confirmation that it is indeed legitimate to have Arabs as part of the political system from within, not just from outside the government.
Alexis, we have change in Israel certainly the last few weeks, but also we have changes also in Iran. We have the elections on the 18th of June. So 8 years of Rouhani government, they've been ended. So, in history, confirm, if you agree, Professor Ram, I think that is the first time after 77 that Likud joined the government became power in Israel during Mohammed Reza Shah. That is the first time also in these few years that we see in a very short time such a regimental change as well. Because now we see that it was first elections in Iran, and they are leaving from the very liberals, they are going to hardliners. And also we have seen from Israel's side, from hardliners, then go to more liberals, if we can say that Naftali Bennett is liberal. So Alexis, in these cases, what is the situation? How does Iran understands this change in Israel, and how do you see the policy of Raisi towards Israel?
Yeah, the Iranian media, their first reaction was that they cheered the change of government in Israel because they thought Bibi Netanyahu was the worst option. So they were very optimistic, I could say. It was very strange to see that in the Iranian media because usually they don't show such an optimism. But they soon reverted to their classical approach after some strikes by Israel in Syria. So they said again that it doesn't matter who is in charge in Israel, the same policy applies. That could we say as a first observation about the Iranian reaction to the Israeli elections.
Do you believe that this change in Israel will lead to any second considerations within Iran about Israel? Not, I mean, to get to have an approach, but I mean to reconsider the political positioning of Israel in the region, or they just believe that Naftali is another Israeli government that is going to change the approach to the Palestinian issue and towards Iran?
Yeah, the Iranian approach towards the Palestinian issue is, we could say, static. With a few exceptions, we could say, we can mention them later. It's static, especially now we have a new president in Iran, but this doesn't mean that we will have a fundamental change in the approach Iran follows towards the Palestinian issue or in foreign policy at large, because the decisions are made not by the president, they are made by the Supreme National Security Council of Iran, which are made by consensus and they are afterwards approved by the Supreme Leader. So we won't have any fundamental change in the Palestinian issue. Maybe the Iranians had maybe a hope that maybe Naftali Bennett won't be so hawkish, mostly in the Syrian arena, I would say, because we have there an inflection point between the two countries. But I see now that the Iranians now are reverting to their approach they have for so many years. So we see no real change towards that.
Hagai, what is the situation now in, it's the questions that I always wanted to ask in this show, waiting for you. What is the situation now in Israel towards Iran? What the politics say, but I mean, when you go out to cafes and there are some issues in the region, what do you get? What is the feeling that the people they get about Iran? Do they believe that Iran is a country that is going to attack Israel? Do they see it as a symmetric and a major threat, as Netanyahu used to present Iran? What do the people believe about Iran?
Well, first of all, let me put this in historical context. Bibi Netanyahu was not the first to make Iran the boogeyman of the region, the axis of evil, or it's part of the axis of evil, as it were. The first to do this, you might be surprised, was Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister who had orchestrated peace with the Oslo agreements, and it was done. In other words, it was done in the 1990s. So he was the first to do so. Later leaders had persisted in it, and of course, Bibi Netanyahu took it to the extreme, right? And his rhetoric, which many have fallen prey to in Israel, was that. As he put it some years ago, the year is 2009. It's 1933. Germany, Iran today is the new Germany, something like that. So in many ways, Israelis who are ignorant, but again, ignorant, not for them to be blamed, because the entire media and the entire press have followed suit and do consider Iran to be the #1 threat against Israel, whose intentions are genocidal, which is, of course, fictitious, which is, of course, untrue. But the fact remains that most Israelis, again, and this cuts across political persuasions, whether you're right-wing or left-wing, whether you're a Likud party or Labor Party, it really doesn't matter. I mean, if there is one consensus among Israelis, is that Iran continues to be a threat to the state of Israel. And many still believe, again, in the myth that its own nuclear program, right, is mostly designed to be able to drop a bomb on Israel. So yes, Iran today, and has been for the past 20 years or so, is regarded as a genocidal threat to the state of Israel, to the Jewish state, in many ways, yes.
So I mean, but what is the claim? How can this justify it? Iran is miles far away from Israel. They do not have, borders. They have, of course, interest borders, because the borders of Iran, Iran has natural borders that we all know, but it has also interest borders that they start from Beirut and end up in Kabul, in the Iranian plateau. But still, I mean, Iran didn't show any kind of movement that, it's against Jewish. I mean, we all remember what happened to the Iranian embassy in Paris, that a member of the consular personnel saved thousands of Jewish Iranians and non-Iranian Jewish. But also, we have never seen Iran to say we want to destroy Jewish people. When they come and they say death to Israel, probably they say Israel needs to cease its operations as it is, if we can say that. But there was no any movement from the side of Iran or even Hamas or Hezbollah to say that we're coming to genocide Jewish.
Well, okay, so I mean, let's try to unpack this very, very complex question. First of all, the underlying assumption is that Iran is an Islamo-fascist regime, which is by its nature anti-Semitic, right? And whose intentions are by and large to expand in the world, and bring about the downfall of Jews in general and the Jewish state in particular. I mean, this has been clear, at least as seen in Israeli discourse, since the 1979 revolution that toppled Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. A. B, of course, Iran does not share any borders with Israel, but the Israeli claim is that Iran is very busy in consolidating what is termed as the Shiite crescent. In which case, of course, Lebanon is the final frontier, and Lebanon does have shared borders with Israel. Israel also claims that Iran provides invaluable support to the Hamas. To the extent the Israeli rationale goes that the Hamas is in many ways an Iranian puppet. Again, of course, disregarding the fact that Iran is a Shiite country and Hamas is a Sunni country. By the way, if we go back a little bit to history in recent years, the entire Second Intifada, which raged between Israel and the Palestinians in the early 21st century, the Israeli official line was that the Palestinians are actually doing the work of Iran in many ways. Again, it is operating as a proxy of Iran. So this is it. I mean, but again, this all goes back to 1979 with the Islamic Revolution, which was interpreted in Israel as, in many ways, an anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist revolution. just to, again, to be fair, there have been on the Iranian side, since the 1979 revolution, there have been some, I should put it, threatening rhetoric towards Israel, to the extent that they said that the Zionist regime of Jerusalem, or the Zionist regime occupying Jerusalem, must be destroyed. But this, again, to be fair, has not been, these declarations have not been made in a vacuum, because Israeli politicians and so on, have also been keen on threatening the Iranian regime. Again, regime change, this invention of George W. Bush's administration in the United States, was taken very seriously and favorably in Israel. And Israelis themselves have put forth the idea that regime change is necessary for Iran. So in many ways, what we have here is a symmetry or equilibrium. On the one hand, Iran threatens, or Iran calls for the demolition of the so-called Zionist regime. And on the other hand, you have Israeli officials who call for regime change. There is really no difference. This is mutual threats that are being advanced by both sides. But Israelis usually tend to remember only the Iranian threats, as though Israel is a passive victim, right, in this large scheme of an Iranian conspiracy to destroy Israel.
Alexis, what is the view of Iranians? I mean, do they have a kind of rhetoric that they come and they say we have to get rid of Israel at any cost? Is this rhetoric against Israel in the big strategy of Iran in order to dominate the region, or just a religious strategy in order to unify Muslims and promote Duma?
Yeah, there are two approaches on that. The first approach is generally, it's an essentialist approach that says that the ideology of the Islamic Republic of Iran says that it is a duty of the Islamic Republic to liberate the Palestinians, the oppressed people of the world. So they say that Iran follows this ideology sincerely. Then there's the other approach, which is a realistic approach, says that ideology only serves legitimizing purposes. It's a smokescreen that conceals realpolitik policies. So I should say that, in my opinion, it's more to the pragmatic side. Not totally, but more to the pragmatic side. Because the Iranians are, when it comes to foreign policy and regional politics, they are very careful. They are very calculated. They use the rhetoric very carefully. Even the extreme rhetoric we hear is calculated. It could be said that it is a posturing that is trying to test the waters, to send some signals to the other side. So one thing for me is that we shouldn't take at face value the rhetoric of Iran, because in Iran, everybody talks about Israel, the Zionist regime, they call it in Iran. From the Friday prayers leader to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to politicians, to even to people who are not even officials, but wield influence. So all this stuff creates confusion what the actual policy of Iran is. But I think the policy is not that it is an ideological conflict. It's more a geopolitical conflict. Because after we could say the collapse of the Soviet Union or the expulsion of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, and Iraq now is, after the expulsion of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, Iraq no longer is the opponent, the main opponent of Israel, or the bastion of the Arab struggle against the Israelis. So we see that the two major powers after the early 90s are now Iran and Israel. So, as Professor Ram previously told, it was Rabin, it was in the early 90s that we saw a more aggressive Israeli policy towards Iran. That was not by luck, it was also calculated. They were, from then on, the two main players in the region. So we see this inflation of the threat, of the Iranian threat from the Israeli side, from one moment to another. So for the Iranian side, should I say what the Iranian side says? The Iranian side says, for example, Khamenei has said many times that when they say the collapse of the Zionist regime, they don't mean that they will throw in the sea the Netanyahu or his government or the Zionists. They mean that this collapse will come from within, not from an external force or from violence. They say that it will come via a referendum where all the true Palestinians in the Iranian sense will participate in this referendum. And of course, the diaspora which came after 1948 will not participate in the Iranian view. So in their view, this is the solution to the Palestinian issue. Okay, this is the rhetoric. It's more complicated in reality. Of course, Iran is supporting Hamas, is supporting Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but it's not supporting them, we could say, not to topple the regime as a first priority. It's more to establish a deterrence capability against Israel, because the threat perception that Iran has of Israel is very high. If you see the defense budget of Israel, which exceeds by billions the one of Iran, it's the only nuclear power in the Middle East. It says a defense cooperation agreement with the United States. Israel has presence on Iranian borders. We can say it has presence in Azerbaijan. It has even presence in Baluchistan. So the Iranians are very real about this threat. So the first thing they think about is not the collapse of the Zionist regime. The first thing they think about is security. And the security is established via external balancing, because Iran has not that capability, so much resources to spend in internal balancing.
May I interject here on this very question, if I may? Thank you. Yes, I agree. Absolutely, I agree with Alexis. I think that the official language is that the Zionist regime will disappear from the pages of history, right? I think that's how it was put. But again, how it will vanish from the pages of history, just as Alexis said, and the Iranians have been emphasizing this time and over again, that this will not come out of because of the Iranian belligerent campaign or policy, but because the Zionist state, as it goes in Iran, is an anachronistic entity, just like the apartheid regime in South Africa, and therefore it will disappear of its own accord internally. That is one. But Alexis talked about the Iranian side, and I think that we should perhaps be a bit more precise here, because what is the Iranian side? The leadership, yes, Alexis has put it very vividly, and I have nothing to add. But I think when we talk about Iranians, there are also regular Iranians, whoever they may be. And regular Iranians, as in contrast to Israelis, they don't really give a damn about Israel. I think, Alexis, you can correct me.
I think it's very true.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
I think it's very true, and I'm making a parenthesis here. I would say that I was in Iran when it was the Turkish attack to Syria. And actually, I used to see all the Iranians, going outside, taking coffee. And I was used to hear from the Greek radio that the situation, is into flames. And I was talking to Iranians, said that, guys, Turkey is invading Syria. And everybody, they used to say to me, listen, our army knows what it's doing. We have nothing to discuss about. It's everything fine, everything's secure, and just enjoy your coffee. But I was in Israel also a few years ago. And, I was going here and there to Tel Aviv and to Jerusalem. And I used to see, the army or even citizens with the guns. And they were on call. So I used to ask my Jewish friends, the Israeli friends, I said, why you guys, you don't give peace. I mean, you walk all away the cities and you just see a lot of Rambos going around with guns. Isn't this prehistoric? I mean, isn't this a sign that you are going to fail, that you have failed as a liberal democracy? This is a question. Is Israel has failed as a liberal democracy?
I don't think that Israel has ever been a liberal democracy. It has been perhaps a liberal democracy insofar as the Jewish population is concerned, but it has never been and I think, I mean, this is an acceptable statement, even in Israeli terms. And yes, there are still people who do believe that Israel is a liberal democracy, but how can it really be a liberal democracy when first of all, you have 20% of its population, Arab population, which of course ostensibly enjoys equal rights, but does not. And how can you call a state a liberal democracy when it has been occupying a territory for such a long time, placing millions, I guess, of people under occupation, whether indirectly, as it does in Gaza, or directly, as it does in the West Bank. So I think that calling Israel a liberal democracy, where you have you have a state in which Jews are superior. It's a Jewish state, right? I mean, it's
by law since 2018, actually.
It's a Jewish state, which means that privileges go to Jews. All the other people, if they can toe behind and show loyalty to the Zionist cause, then they may be partially accepted. But this is not really a liberal democracy in any sense of the word. I think it's a charade.
Professor, maybe Iran, what is considered, Israel as an anachronistic and prehistoric state. I mean, maybe they are right. That's why, they are vowing and all the time they accuse Israel that, Iran has, by constitution, recognizes 4 religions. So when I was in Iran, I could go to the mosque to pray. I could go to the Armenian Orthodox Church. Now they have TV shows in more than 4 languages, in Urdu, in Balochi, in Azeri. So actually the population learns Farsi, but at the same time they have their own language that they can be taught either at the university. For example, there is the Kurdish language in Kurdistan. But from that side, we see Israel that comes in 2018. I mean, after 70 years being established, confirming that it is a Jewish state, and from the legal point, but also political point, abolish any rights of non-Jewish people.
Well, okay. First of all, again, let's not look at the Iranian regime so romantically, right? Because in many ways, Iran and Israel are very similar, because in Iran you do have, and again, Alexis probably knows this much better than I do, since I have not been dealing with Iran in recent years. But the hegemonic ethnic group in Iran, right, are the Persians, who number only 37% of the population. Am I correct, Alexis? Or maybe wrong here?
I think it's over. I think it's over 50.
It's not simple like that. This is it's more in the Western media. They are focusing on this, on the Persians. Persia always was part of the Iranian plateau. When we speak of Iran, we are speaking of the Iranian. It's the overriding ethnic principle of being Iranian. The Iranianness, Iraniyat. So the Loris, the Baluchis, all these are Iranian tribes. So it's not that simple. And when we speak about, another big talk is about the Iranian Azerbaijanis. So the Iranian Azerbaijanis are a very big part. They're even more than the Azerbaijanis who reside in Azerbaijan itself. They are more. But these Azerbaijanis who live in Iran, many people are very well integrated by Iranian standards. I'm talking always. So they're even mixed. They are mixed. So we see many officials who are Iranian, they are Persian Azerbaijanis. For example, Khamenei, for example, Rahim Safavi, or the ex-prime minister and leader of the Green Movement, Mir Hossein Mousavi, many officials. We can tens of them call them. So it's not that distinct. It's not this black and white. The Azerbaijanis are against the Persians. After so many centuries being under empires, there have been mixtures of the population. Yes, they are focused mainly in northern Iran, but there have been mixtures. So we don't have to underestimate the Iranian principle. To be Iranian, it's an overriding principle. It transcends the Persian, the Azerbaijani, the Lori, and all these tribes, because there are a lot of tribes in Iran, Iranian tribes.
What I'm trying to say is that in Iran too, there is a campaign of Persianizing the population, right? In many ways, in a way, even those tribes which do not consider and are not interested in integrating into the Iranian body politic. And again, I may be perhaps a bit more.
I think, Professor, from my research and being in Iran, I didn't see any kind of concept of making all Iranians Persians. What I see, and it's very vivid in Iran, is that Iran, it was part of the Persian Empire. So from their side, they see Iran as the product of the Persian Empire. So, for example, we have seen recently that the president of the parliament, he's been to, large scale of trips, and he's been photographed with people in nomadic dresses. He visited places like in desert, in the mountains. So actually, those populations, they cannot be Persianized per se and by nature. When they are moving all around Iran, they have their own language, but they use also Farsi for transactions reasons. For when you go out to the mountains, you see people that they speak, for example, Georgians. There are Georgian villages that they speak Georgians, but from the other side, when they sit in the night, they sing in the way Ferdowsi and Shahnameh. Or, for example, when I've been in Iraq, you see there the Kurds that they celebrate Nowruz in the more ancient Persian way. So, and I see that Persians is the biggest group in Iranian state, but I see Iranian state as as Shimperial, which means that is using Islam as a religion to unify the population Shia. But it is an imperial power, not in the concept that they want to have more territory, but to have more influence in the Iranian plateau, that they believe that in the one or the other way they can be very dominant with their culture or their politics. But we don't see in Iran, for example, we have mixed weddings. I know people Kurds that with us there is that they are married and they are just Iranians. At home they speak Iranian, or they learn some Kurdish or some Azeris. By the way, Azeris it is in a way it's Asian Persian language, been part of Turkish language the last 200 years, but we don't see it so extremely. For example, I will not go to Iran and someone is an Azer is going to say to me, "Is a Kurd, don't talk to him," or "I hate him." Or, for example, in Baluchi, I'm not going to talk to the man from Isfahan because he's a Persian. We don't see it in that way. They just believe that they are Iranian citizens. They belong, let's say, to the Iranian state. So from their part, it's very clear they are Iranians. It's not the same what we see in Israel. For example, when I come to Israel, I know that this is Jew, the other one is Arab, the other one is Palestinian, that he has the paper, not even the passport, so he cannot really travel, and the other one is Druze. So in Iran, there is no this kind of differentiation. For example, we have mixed weddings. For example, Christians, they can marry Muslims, and they are not supposed to be converted as well. They can keep their religion. So, for example, if I go to Iran, I can marry a Shia or a Sunni, for example, and I am not supposed to be converted. But I think in Israel, still the discrimination is there. I mean, the citizens, certainly they belong to camps. And I think that the worst dilemma, and maybe is a very untrue dilemma from the part of Israel, is that are you with the state of Israel, and those that they are not with the state of Israel, from the very beginning they belong to the others. But by nature, those by others are the non-Jewish. And especially how the Constitution and what the Knesset is doing is with the laws that passed after 2009 under Netanyahu leadership.
Paulina, may I add something before we go to Israel concerning Iran? Yeah, okay. We have to be pragmatic though and realistic. So yeah, it's not perfect. For example, Baluchistan is the poorest region of Iran. Or, for example, we see that the Khuzastanis we saw previously who demonstrated about the cuts in the water supply made demonstrations, but these demonstrations were not ethnically based. They were not Arabic demonstrations because they were more about demands for the living standard. So to minimize the Persians or Iran to the Persians, I think is a mistake. It's like saying that, for example, in our case in Greece, in ancient Greece, it's like saying that all Greece were the Athenians. It's the same thing. They were not the Athenians. There were so many city-states. In Iranian case, there were so many kingdoms in ancient times, Iranian kingdoms. So it's the same thing. Because Persian, it's okay. It's something that is very convenient for the Western mind to understand, but it's not only Persian. It's many tribes, as I said before. So I think that when we talk about Iran, we should talk more about the Iranian ethnic identity, not the Persian. The Persian is just one part of the Iranian identity. Just that.
Professor, what did the basic law of 2018 that came to surface in Israel? How did this affect the identity of the Israeli society?
It has just given credence to what perhaps Israeli Jews have been feeling, or have been feeling since many years before. Israel is a democratic, progressive, modern state. The Arab surroundings are inferior, are backward, and thus Israel is the Europe of the Middle East, or as Ehud Barak had put it way back, I think, in 2006, that Israel is a villa in the jungle, right? So what the basic law had actually, it just gave official credence to that feeling that this is a Jewish state by definition, by its nature, and that the Jews are privileged in most ways that are imaginable, and that there are some non-Jews, such as Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Druze, that can enjoy partial integration, but never full integration into Israeliness in many ways. What it had done, which is tragic, is to cancel or to demote, as it were, the Arabic language, which was considered an official language of the state, for the sheer reason that 20% of the population of Israel are Arabs, speak Arab and read Arabic, had demoted it to a status that is sort of an in-between. It's no longer an official language of the state, but it is a language that one has to give special attention to. I don't really remember the exact wording or phrasing, but this is what it had done. In a way, yes, putting one more buffer between Jews and Arabs, not only in Palestine, not only within Israel, but also in the surroundings, right? So yes, so in many ways, Israel has surrounded itself not only with military barricades, but also in mental way, mentality, right? So it shuts himself off from the region where it exists.
You know, it's very interesting what you say, and you describe it perfectly, actually. And this is the feeling that also I received when I visited the country many times. You know, how did Arab Jewish, I mean, the people that came from Morocco, they came from Yemen, they came from Iraq, how did they see this law? Because those people that they came from Iraq and from Morocco, they speak, of course, Arabic at home, they speak Hebrew, but of course they speak Arabic.
No. And this is another tragic consequence. There has been a, what's the word? A poll conducted by the Van Leer Institute of Jerusalem, which came up with astonishing results. That there are only 0.4% of Israeli Jews, 0.4% of Israeli Jews who can actually utter a logical sentence in Arabic, or can actually read a simple press report in Arabic, which means that also the descendants of those immigrants who came from the Arab world and from North Africa, or even, from Arab language, from Arab countries, have, in order to integrate into the state of Israel, have been willing, by the way, in much of the same way as other migrants and immigrants in other countries who wanted to be integrated into the larger society. So those descendants, the children, grandchildren of those immigrants have shunned the native tongue of their parents and preferred to forget it.
So Professor, is the same with the Jews that they came from Eastern Europe or from Central Europe? For example, I mean the people that they came from Germany and these countries that they used to speak Yiddish at home, they speak Hebrew and then don't speak Yiddish.
Well, I have to admit, my parents were born in Poland. Sorry, my father was born in Tel Aviv in Palestine. My mother, his parents immigrated from Poland. My mother is Polish. They used to speak Yiddish, and I used to view it as a backward language, and I distanced myself from it. But it's not the same thing. Again, it's not the same thing because our region, we are situated in the Middle East. We're not situated in Eastern Europe. We are part of the Levant. We are part of a Levantine culture, right? Geographically, culturally, by sheer number, I mean, demographically, most Israelis are of Mizrahi descent. That is, they are descendants of people, of families who came from the Arab world and from North Africa, right? We are located in the Middle East. Because of that, there is a duty. We are duty bound, all Israelis, to speak and read the language of the cultural and geographic territory and place where we reside. So it's much more tragic for Israelis not to speak Arabic, again, just for the sheer fact that there are 20% of Arabs living within the so-called Green Line, right? Right? Then there is really no, it is not really, I'm not required to speak German or Yiddish or Polish, right? I should be able to speak with my Arab neighbor. I should be able to read Palestinian novelists. I should be able to read Palestinian press. The language barrier is the number one barrier that divides between people and creates hostility and phobia against others. In order to bridge this gap, we must be able to speak and read in each other's language, to recognize the language of the people whom we live with. And the tragic fact is that only 0.4 of Israeli Jews can do that. And until this is done, there is no way for coexistence between Jews and Arabs in this country.
Professor, do the Palestinians and the Arabs and the Druze, do they learn Hebrew in order to survive?
They have to learn Arabic. They have to learn Hebrew. Again, for their livelihood, right? To be able to live within Israel, one must know Hebrew. And in order to be integrated and have an honorable profession, and Arab students, and I see this with my university, right? They come to the university and they must be knowledgeable of Hebrew. Otherwise, they cannot graduate and finish their studies successfully. If they want to work within Israel, which many Arabs do, they must speak Hebrew. Otherwise, there is no way for them to survive economically, culturally, socially. So, of course, Arabs, by and large, speak and read Hebrew.
You know, Professor, Alexi will come to you after this question. You know, Professor, for me it was quite strange. When I've been there, I travel a lot to the country. And, you know, it was very, very funny for me. I've been to Acre. I think I told you before, to the north of Israel, to Acre, and to some other places. And I thought that I am in Cairo. You know, it was so shocking because I thought that I am in an Arabic country. You know, it was more close to Cairo than, let's say, look like a Western country. And from the other side, I used to have my Jewish friends taking us to Arabic restaurants. And we used to say, well, we don't go to another restaurant. No, I mean, these restaurants are perfect. I mean, let's go to see people. So from the one side, we used to see the Arabs that actually they welcome us to the restaurant. They speak some Arabic and they were fluent in Hebrew. But from the other side, you could see the distance as well. The Arabs, they will talk to us, but they wouldn't be so close to Jewish. And, you know, there is this close, but at the same time away mentality or culture, let's say, in Israel, that for me, you know, it was so strange because I've been also to many other countries. I've been to Damascus and Syria before the war. I've been to Lebanon. I've been to Iraq. I've been to Iran. I've been, you know, I traveled in so many places, but it's the first time that I have seen that we want to be together, but at the same time we have to be away in order, you know, to manage to survive.
Yes, I agree with you. Israel is in many ways a Mediterranean country. I mean, again, also when I visit, you know, Cyprus, when I visit Greece, when I visit Italy, I have this notion, I have this feeling sometimes that this is not strange. But even more so, Israel is a Levantine country. Levantine country. And that's what your impressions are absolutely on the mark, are absolutely in the mark. But yes, of course, there is, but in relation to your question about relations between Arabs and Jews, yes, of course, there is this hostility, always under the surface, in the best case, right? The best case. And when push comes to shove, like the last war on Gaza, right? You saw that this whole notion of coexistence between Jews and Arabs is a complete myth. There has never been such a thing. And yes, so I fear that, you know, 3, 4 more crises like this that we had in April or May, right? If they should, God forbid, happen, this could actually very well lead to a civil war. And we were quite close to it in the last round of fighting between Israel and Gaza in May, right? In the so-called mixed cities, Jaffa, Acre, right? Jerusalem, Beersheba, Ramla, Lod, Lida in Arabic. And so this is, I think, the number one threat. This is why I think that the Arab-Palestinian conflict is the number one threat to the state of Israel, because it has the potential of developing into a real catastrophic civil war. Now, if we tie this to Iran, as we were speaking before, and we'll probably speak again in a minute, Iran is not the #1 threat to the state of Israel. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is. And what Israel has been doing, right, in dramatizing the Iranian threat is trying to bypass, to divert attention away, domestically and on the international front, that the real problem is Israel's problem with the Palestinians.
Alexis, is Israel a threat to Iran?
Yeah, the threat perception in Iran now is that after the withdrawal of the U.S. forces and the NATO allies from Afghanistan, we could say that the threat perception now is more towards the Israelis. But this is nothing static. This changes. In the 80s, the #1 threat were the Iraqis. In the 90s, it were the Americans, which were opening bases in the states of the Persian Gulf, in the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. So this changed. And again, in the early 2000s, the #1 threat were the Americans, because the Iranians had the threat perception that the Americans tried to encircle Iran, and the neoconservatives were talking about regime change. So if you were an Iranian and heard the neoconservatives talking about regime change in Iran, or for example, where would we go after Afghanistan? Would we go left or right? So all this kind of talk from the American side truly generated real concerns in the Iranian side. So we could say that now there are many threats. We see now another threat, again in the eastern borders from Afghanistan, which is a source of instability historically for the Iranian side, which is the drug trafficking, the Taliban. But we could say again that, yes, Israel is considered more of a threat than the Saudis, for example. Because we have to bear in mind that the Israelis are the ones that right now have the nuclear monopoly in the Middle East, which is a very important issue we many times forget to say. The ones who have the nuclear bomb are the Israelis.
What is the perception, Alexis? Is the negotiations in Vienna are going to continue, and maybe are we going to reach an agreement with the United States and the other countries?
Yeah, it was. We thought that maybe the Rouhani administration would conclude an agreement the final days of its administration, but there was a decision that further talks should be made after the new president takes over, Ebrahim Raisi. So the next government will continue the talks. The 7th round of talks will be held with the new government. And in my opinion, yeah, okay, Ebrahim Raisi now is showing that he is a harder negotiator. He presents himself that he will preserve and the national interest and the dignity of the Iranians, which means that he wants a face-saving solution for his side. That's what it means. But I think that the Iranian establishment has reached the conclusion that they must revive the JCPOA, because the #1 threat inside Iran is the economic instability. We see
Alexis,
that.
Do you believe that?
In the last 3 years, we see more and more demonstrations with economic demands, frustration about the rents, about the inflation, about the younger generation who cannot find a job. I think this is the #1 concern, and this is in the election campaign of Raisi. This was his #1 priority to boost the economy. This was to boost the economy, to help the poor, to improve the economy. This was his #1 priority in his election campaign.
Alexei, do you
not
think
about
that
Israel, not about, for example, the United States. Foreign policy was not even an issue in the pre-election campaign. The pre-election campaign centered on economic issues, about butter and sugar.
Do you believe that Iran is exaggerating about what's going on in the region? I mean, they're coming in the, in the last years, a lot of people, including what is left from Saddam Hussein outside Iraq, and also people that are against Hezbollah or against Assad, they say that Iran is interfering in our politics, it's a dominant power. But now they're planning a kind of axis. It's not really a Shia axis, but it's an axis of interfering and domination into the regional politics. Do you believe that Iranians exaggerate into this? Do they are really interested into involving in the foreign affairs of other countries? And is that a kind of strategy in order also to approach Israel and be a kind of threat to the northern border of Israel through Hezbollah?
Okay, yes. Okay, the Iranian side officially says that it is not interfering in other countries' affairs. It is there because the governments of Syria or Iraq invited them to go. Okay, but this is, okay, cannot believe this. They're actually, they are interfering. For example, we see the influence of Iran in Iraq and the political affairs. The same applies to Syria. Of course, there's an interference because every time Iran feels threatened, it automatically responds with increasing its presence in the region. It wants to create a security circle, zones of influence beyond its borders. Because after the Iran-Iraq war, which is the never-again moment of the Iranian history, Iranians decided that they will never again leave threats to come into their territory. This was the greatest lesson of the Iran-Iraq war. So, yes, the Iranians, we see the Iranian presence. We see now in Syria that Iran is trying to entrench itself. We see that the Iranians have built many military bases in Iran, which the Iranians call, they call them advisory centers, but we know that they are military bases actually. As well, the same, Iraq is a different case now. We see that after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, we are in a transition period. We see that Iran has some problems with its control mechanisms towards some Shiite militias. So I think Iraq right now is the biggest challenge for the Iranian influence. But Iran has also a plan, a strategy, which it follows with strategic patience. The plan is to create a third front against Israel, to say. And this third front is in the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. So
do you believe that Iran can attack Israel?
No. Even the RGC journals of the revolutionary guards, their journals say that they want the third front for deterrence purposes. They don't say they want to attack Israel, to make an invasion. Their first concern is deterrence. So Israel won't even think about attacking nuclear facilities of Iran, or don't even think about sabotaging, as we see in the last year, many sabotages in the Iranian soil. So the Iranians think that if they build this capacity around, they want to encircle this Israel. So they think that if they complete this encirclement, Israel would be with no options to push or to pressure Iran. That's the first thing the Iranians are thinking about. It's not about toppling the Israeli regime militarily.
Haggai, I was never really a fan of Netanyahu, but after every speech of Netanyahu, a smile used to come out to my face. And especially when you used to go to UN, taking out pictures of Tehrani neighbors saying, this is a facility, we found this and we found the other. But at the end of the day, he was like a salesman in the United Nations instead of being a guardian of Israel and the people of Israel. Many times he has threatened, I'm going to attack Israel even if United States don't follow.
I'm going to attack Iran, not Israel.
Yes, I'm going to attack Iran even if United States don't follow. How true is that? Does he has this kind of capacity? Israel has this kind of capacity?
This is a very interesting question, and I can only answer that in a historical perspective. He may or may not have had real intentions. Okay? Okay, I'll get to that in a minute. He may or may not have had a clear-cut intention. But I tell you, this is a historian who has studied at least, history, is that usually in times like that, when states exchange verbal attacks, these can create their own dynamic. And hence, the people who utter these words will lose control. And then war erupts. And the people who exchange these words will no longer have control of what they had done. Words have meaning. And it can easily deteriorate into a real war. War of words can very easily deteriorate into a real war. I myself think that if Israel attacks Iran, it will have catastrophic consequences. Catastrophic. I have read in several places that Benjamin Netanyahu, but even more than Benjamin Netanyahu, Ehud Barak, when he was a defense minister, had a clear and unequivocal plan to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. Thank God that did not happen. Again, as I said, my only concern, I would like to imagine that Israelis, notwithstanding the rhetoric, understand that going to war with Iran will have dramatic, catastrophic, and even, I would dare say, tragic consequences. I would like to imagine that the Israelis who make the decisions are fully aware of that, despite the rhetoric. Again, this is my hope. But again, since being a historian, I know that many follies have been made by statesmen and politicians. I cannot rely on them, on these people, whether it is Naftali Bennett or Benjamin Netanyahu. I cannot.
Ehud Barak, he had this kind of plan that if there was a kind of symmetric threat by Iran, could be an attack or a better sabotage to Iranian nuclear facilities. But, when he was a prime minister, he made this kind of, very vivid statement and said that if I was living in the Palestinian territories under the oppression, probably I would also be a member of Hamas. That was very awkward and very odd for us to hear that. How this has been seen by the Israelis and the Israeli society.
Again, Israeli society is not a monolith, and we have to differentiate it who says what, right? I mean, there has been backlash against this statement, and there have been people, so-called liberal Jews, who were supportive of that argument. But it has nothing to do with Iran. This has, everything to do with the domestic front and with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Vis-a-vis Iran, Ehud Barak has always been very belligerent, very belligerent. Now, since he's a civilian, he speaks. By the way, now since he's a civilian, he's very much invested in the medical cannabis industry, and he's very happy with that. He does not concern himself very much with politics, although he sometimes writes columns to Haaretz. But yes, again, so he said it, but practice speaks much louder than words in many ways, right? Or practice is much louder than words. So he should not just talk the talk, but also walk the walk, right? I appreciate what he had said, but it is far from being sufficient or far from being enough, right? I mean, it is an empathy towards the enemy, understanding where he or she come from, what are his or her concerns and incentives, right? But it's not enough. It's certainly not enough. I wish there were more Israelis who would say this, but again, I could count them on the palm of my hand. I mean, this is really not enough.
Alexis, what is the influence of Iran in the Levant going to the foreign policy? And it's going to come also on the other way, this question to Professor. What is the influence of Iran to Levant after the Islamic Revolution, especially the last 10 years?
Yeah, it's very huge if we consider that it's a Shia state. It's a Shia island in a Sunni ocean. So if we bear in mind that the Shias are approximately 10 to 15% of the Muslim population, it's tremendous what Iran has achieved. And that's why we say that the Iranians are pragmatic, because they know that if they emphasize their sectarian identity, they won't have influence. And we see they have influence with actors that are not Shias. Yeah, for example, a lot of influence with Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who are Sunnis. They have influence with Syria, which is the Alawites. Okay, they were recognized by Iran in the last 15, 20 years as part of the Shia world, but okay, not even the Iranians consider them as Shias. Or we can, for example, in Afghanistan, the Iranians wield tremendous influence to the Tajiks. The Tajiks are not Sunnis. They are not Shias, sorry, they are Sunnis. So we see that the Iranians emphasize, according to their audience, a different identity. So in the Arab world, knowing that they are a minority, they are not an Arab country, they are Iranians, they emphasize Muslim unity, a pan-Islamic rhetoric, because they know that so they can have more soft power. In Central Asia or on its eastern borders, Iran emphasizes the pre-Islamic identity to wield more influence. The Iranians are pretty flexible in this regard, because they know how to play the long game. So we can say that the Iranians have very, very big influence. For example, Yemen is an example. Before 10 years, we couldn't even think of Iranians having influence in Yemen. And now we see that the Ansarullah movement is controlling large swaths of the Yemen territory. We see that the Syrian regime survived. Even the Iranians are now entrenching themselves. So yes, I could say that the influence of Iran has never been so broad, so deep, ever before. With a quiet exception with Iraq, as I told you before. I think that Iraq right now is the biggest challenge of the Iranian regional policy, and after that is Afghanistan.
Can I interject here? Yes. We should not forget that this Iranian influence on Lebanon, although we tend to think of it as sort of a recent phenomenon, it is not recent at all. It goes back to the beginning of the 16th century.
Yeah.
So there is
family ties since then.
So this is not, and then of course during in the 1950s and 1960s, right? This is not a sort of a new phenomenon in the Middle East. Iran has had direct contacts, cultural, political, social, with Lebanon since the beginning of the 16th century, for several reasons, which of course we don't have really time to get into. So what we see here is actually an extension of something that has a historical depth, and it's not necessarily based solely on strategic considerations, right? This is something which is really substantial in terms of history, culture, society, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I think that there is a kind of constructivism behind the reality and the pragmatism of Iranian foreign policy, which means that, of course, there is strategy, that Iran has a long-term strategy in what is planning. So probably Iran knows what is going to happen and what wants to happen the next 50 years. I'm sure about it. But behind it, there are some tools that Iran is using to approach in this kind of flexibility. So when it goes to Central Asia, it talks about Persia and Shahnameh. When it comes to Lebanon and Levant, talks about Shiism and talks about Ummah. So Iran is very flexible, but from the other side, probably this is the heritage of a big empire. And that's why Iran never forgot that, yes, it has borders, but of course it has also interest borders. And it has a kind of it has some tools and also some bases that that can use in order to influence the whole territory. Professor, what is the influence of Israel to Levant? Or let's have a second scale in this question. What is the influence that you would like Israel to have to Levant?
The influence has been a destructive one. I mean, Israel has gone to war with Lebanon at least twice since the 1980s, right? That has wrought destruction, dispossession, and 20-year occupation since 1982. That's on the northern front. On the southern front, Gaza. So there's really nothing to be too proud of if you're an Israeli. But what I would like to see is, I think that Israel should, how should I put it? No, I'll try to put it delicately. That Israel should open itself up to the Levant, consider itself part of the Levantine surroundings, which is, of course, a precondition for conciliation and recognition of its neighbors, whether they live outside its borders, and its Arab and Palestinian citizenry, and the occupation, of course. I think that's another precondition. Opening up to the region, culturally, socially, politically, and economically.
Professor, why Israel to do that? If we assume that, as we discussed before, if we say that Israel and Iran are the two biggest powers in the region, and we see that Iran, I mean, as Greeks, for example, we know everything about Iran. I am learning Iranian history for 8 years at school because of the time we talk about the Persian Wars. So, when I went to Iran, I almost know what I'm going to see to Persepolis, and it was so funny. I knew everything about Iran, and even now, I discussed with some Iranian friends here in Cyprus, and they are laughing. They said to me, I mean, it's something like you were born Persian. But, I mean, we learn Persian history for 8 years at school because of the Greco-Persian Wars. But, I mean, if we say that this is the two biggest powers, still I know a lot of things about Iran, and of course I can go to Iran. I'm very happy to do so, but still Iran is not open. I mean, Iran gives out what it wants to give out. I mean, it keeps a lot for itself, and for example, it's very difficult for someone that is not Iranian to discover Iran. And of course, there is this kind of strategy, endo-strategy, that everything goes back to the mother state, that Iran is not going to give you more that it wants. It's not going to learn it to give you or to learn more than they want. I mean, why Israel is supposed to open itself if Iran doesn't do it? And it's the biggest enemy, let's say, at this period.
But you were talking about the Levant.
Yes. But Iran doesn't open itself. Why Israel to feel secure to open and disclose itself to Arabs and to the rest of the Levant?
Because it has no other choice of survival. Because otherwise, it will also always be considered a foreign alien entity in the place where it exists. Because Jews have chosen to come here and live here. I mean, where I live in Israel. By the way, probably on top of ruins of an Arab village, right? Israel should acknowledge it. Israel should open itself up to its immediate neighbors, its immediate population, if it wants to survive. Iran is a whole different matter. Iran is a whole different matter. It can't open itself to Iran, okay, because again, also the distance and also the current animosity. But you know, if we shift our discussion to Iran, there is a lot that we don't know that goes under the radar. For instance, Iranian Jews often visit Israel to visit their families who had immigrated to Israel with the implicit consent of the Iranian government, right? We know way back in the Iran-Iraq War, we know that Israel had sold military equipment to Iran with the direct approval of Ayatollah Khomeini, right? So what I'm trying to say is that there are things that are happening and that are still under our radar, and they may perhaps develop. Look, Iran is never going to be pro-Zionist. We should accept that. I mean, the secular forces or the Shah or his sons and descendants are not in any time soon about to return to Iran. Iran will remain in the foreseeable future, and even perhaps, again, I'm a historian, I'm no prophet, but I can speculate nonetheless. Iran will remain country, an Islamic country, Islamist country for years to come. If change comes in Iran, I think it will come from the inside. It will come by way of development. It will come through a process. Not an abrupt process like a revolution. I think that the Iranian regime is well prepared to deal with such a thing. So if there's any political change, I think it will come from the inside. It will come through a developmental process, not by any abrupt means that will bring about the end of the Ayatollahs, as it were. And I think that Israel should come to terms with it. And you know what Israel should do as well? Something which most Israelis never speak about. And that is acknowledge their role in facilitating the autocratic rule of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. Israel has, in many ways, established his secret police. Israel had offered him much economic, social, and political support. Israel took part in many corruption schemes during his reign, selling weapons in real estate, and so on and so forth. So the Iranian memory of Israel, and you ask why the Iranian Revolution was so hostile to Israel. One of the main reasons for that was remembering the Israeli role in Iran during the Shah, right? And how there was a close alliance between the two countries, and how Israel has been able to support his regime, to strengthen his regime to the extent that had made him an autocratic ruler. So if you ask why Iranians are still hostile to Israel, certainly grown-up or adults who still have some vivid or an inkling of memory of what had transpired, this is the reason that Iranians are in many ways still very much hostile to Israel. That close alliance with the Shah, with the autocratic Shah. So opening up to Iran means to kind of understand that this regime is not going anywhere soon, and Israelis should recognize it. and B, yes, also take responsibility for what it had done in the 1960s and 1970s.
Professor, I mean, how can Iran, how can Israel survive in this region? I mean, let's say that something is changing, is approaching Palestinians in a better way. Let's say if this ever happened, but what's going to happen? We have Israel had issues with Hezbollah. It has all around enemies. I mean, why Israel is not? Does Israel is claiming that and do all the wars in order to survive, but is Israel getting itself into this situation in order to create a kind of unity inside Israel, because there are a lot of differences even between Jewish?
So what is the question, though? I mean,
so the question is that maybe the aggressive external foreign policy of Israel is designed in that way in order to keep inside the country in a very united way, because there are a lot of problems also. I mean, the Greeks, Jewish, they have different synagogues than the Irish, and also, I mean, we see that not all Jews, they understand each other. I mean, we have seen so many times Orthodox Jewish being aggressive to Israel state and to authorities. So inside Israel, there are a lot of issues. So maybe this kind of external foreign policy and all these security matters is also a way to keep the country unified.
Of course, I mean, this is not unique to Israel. I think that many times states have gone to war. I could give you several examples. States have gone to war in order to mobilize its citizenry around it or behind it. That's the ABC of statehood, as it were. Yes, of course, war is a means to get people behind it. This happens in Iran, it happens in Israel, it happens in many other places. Yes, I think that Israel has been relying on power for too long. Israel will not be able to rely on power forever. And therefore, Israel has to come to terms with its own vicinity. And peace only means coming to empathize with the other, understand his grievances, understand the wrongs that you had committed, and creating a society that respects each other, respects each other's identity, traditions, history, and so on and so forth, which also requires, learning to speak the language of your neighbor.
Why did the Druze in Israel choose to follow, and be, apply, the statehood of Israel in the most, let's say, be almost Jewish, even, they joined the army. I mean, they try to facilitate this themselves. They go out to the streets with the Israeli flag. They sing out the Hatikva anthem. How this small community within Israel managed to become a pro-Jewish minority?
Well, it depends on which Druze you are referring to, because the Druze in the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights, they see themselves first and foremost as Syrians, not as Israelis. To the extent that they refuse to hold Israeli identification cards. But the rest of the Druze, and usually northern Israel, I mean, again, this is a sort of phenomenon which you see elsewhere in the world, where you have minorities who try to integrate into the larger society. And in Israel, in order to integrate into the larger society, one serves in the army, which is, of course, a sacred symbol in Israeli society. So it is the army is a means for social mobilization. which is perhaps one of the main venues which is open for Druze to be able to integrate into society. Which is, of course, why so many Druze prefer to go to the army and even celebrate their army service to great extent.
Alexis, do you see that Iran, to the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas, has affected the decisions of Hamas? Or it was just like supplying army equipment and, mobilize Hamas?
I don't think so that they played any role. Okay, I have no knowledge of that. I cannot be sure about that. I have not the info. But my thinking on this is that I don't think so. I think that Hamas had more political motivations for the Palestinian elections because it extended now. We have now a new phase. Hamas extended its deterrence even to the west, to East Jerusalem. That's a completely new phase. Until now, Hamas had a deterrence in Gaza. So, if we see what the Hamas leadership was telling, it was demonstrating itself as the protector of the Palestinians, not only in the Gaza Strip, but in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and even of the Arabs inside Israel. So I think the motivations were more internal. I don't know. That's what I see. So yes, the Iranians, of course, have invested heavily in Hamas by providing money, mostly technological know-how, because it's very difficult to transport the spare parts or parts of the missiles. It's very difficult because of the. So I think, yeah, that's my take on this.
Professor, last question to you and last question also to Alexis. And I believe that we are starting once again in October, so I believe that in November, December, we'll be happy once again to host you in another panel. I'm sure that a lot of developments they are coming, and we're going to have also RISI governance, and Naftali is going to be more exposed, to developments. So we will see what is the underline between the two countries. So my question is, what do you expect to happen after the last conflict between Israel and Hamas? Do politicians, especially in Israel, they reconsider their positioning in the Middle East? Is there any backup plan? We see a lot of Jewish, they try to get passports of Poland, of Iraq. They want to have, a plan B if something goes back. Is it possible something to goes back, or here in Cyprus and in Greece we see Israel as such a power country that nothing can happen. It's like the big military infrastructure in the region that no one can defeat. What is the situation after the conflict? What kind of thoughts exist in the politics?
It's not just the last conflict. This is the phenomenon which you mentioned, Israelis getting passports, foreign passports.
Is it possible? Is it easy? This to happen. For you, is it possible to have a Polish passport or an Iraqi that is there 2 generations in Israel to get an Iraqi passport?
It's possible. It's possible. Yes. Portuguese, Polish, British. Now, we also have a very interesting phenomenon where descendants of Moroccan Jews apply for a Moroccan passport, and the Moroccan government is encouraging that. I have a couple of friends who have issued for themselves a Moroccan passport. Now, it doesn't mean that that these Israelis who now carry with them a passport of another nation, another state or another country, doesn't mean that they are about to leave Israel anytime soon, but it is an indication that, at least initial, that people are beginning to question whether or not this is what they want or how they want to live. So having another passport is something which you put in your drawer, right? And you kind of save it for a darker day. You don't really think about it, but you feel more safe. You feel more safe when you have it, and when things will become unbearable, they will have a place to migrate to.
Is it the life of Jewish becoming unbearable?
I'm sorry?
Is it the life of Jewish becoming unbearable in Israel? I mean, do they feel that the situation politically there and in the neighborhood is very difficult for them to survive in Israel?
Unfortunately, no, because again, Israelis live in a strange world of denial. There is a sort of a facade of normalness, right? When you walk the streets of Tel Aviv, not too many people think of the fact or are aware of the fact that merely 25 kilometers away from them, there are scores of people who live under occupation, military occupation. So Israelis live in denial. Iran helps them in a way that making Iran a greater threat to Israel is a means for them to forget that the real problem is in their backyard. This is again where Iran comes from. This is why Iran plays such a great role in Israel, right? Why is Iran considered, to be the greatest threat to Israel, whereas it is not? It helps Israelis kind of forget or suffer from an amnesia about their immediate vicinity, which is the Palestinian problem. Israelis are, by any, again, by international polls that have been made, Israelis are one of the most content people in the world, despite all the, the political and social and economic problems that Israel is facing. So there's a sort of
that has to do with the historical, memoir of Holocaust, or for something like everybody is running after them. So this is the Kana. We need to stay here. This is our mission.
Yes, of course. The Holocaust is the memory of the Holocaust is yet another. How should I put it? Is another thing that allows Israelis to behave as bullies in this area, in the sense that we shall never again permit this to happen once again. Okay, so the Holocaust is resuscitated and its memory persists in many ways in order for Israelis to do things with impunity.
Alexis, there was a statement by Ahmadinejad in 2015 in one interview that says that the Holocaust is not only about Jewish. I believe that this statement is being made because it was the time that Israel was pushing Obama administration into leaving the nuclear agreement, not to proceed to any consensus with Iran. So actually, Ahmadinejad used very well the logic of bullying and knew how to make Jewish feel bad, and how to attack them, but attack them in a way to make them aware that we know how to touch you and this be painful. Last question to you: is there any anti-Semitism in Iran?
Yeah, okay, that's not from scratch. There must be something there, of course. This rhetoric is not from nothing. Of course, there are some sentiments, anti-Semitic sentiments, we could say, or it's out of ignorance. For example, Ahmadinejad when we talk about Ahmadinejad, he was the favorite. He was the favorite president because he produced all these Ahmadinejadisms for the Western media to play all day long. So Ahmadinejad, for example, to see this erratic nature of Iran. For example, Ahmadinejad made all these comments, these controversial comments during his presidency about that the Holocaust was a myth, that all this and more, hundreds. I've researched hundreds of statements by Ahmadinejad. But at the same time, we see that the right hand of Ahmadinejad is Fadia Rahim Mashai. His closest aide made remarks that the Iranians are friends with the Israeli people, and he even encouraged them to visit Iran as tourists. So that's typical Iran. We hear one thing and then we hear the opposite thing even from the same faction. So when we talk about the anti-Israeli rhetoric, we have to have a broader mind. Broad mind is that it may be ideological, but at the same time serves pragmatic purposes. So if the two things didn't coincide, it would be, maybe we wouldn't have seen this harsh rhetoric. Okay, even Ahmadinejad's rhetoric was very harsh for Iranian standards, we could say that. But it served very well, this rhetoric, if we see this, for the soft power of Iran. It's not by chance that Ahmadinejad, after the 2006 war, the 33-day war, or 34th day war, he was the second most populous figure in the Middle East. That's very huge for an Iranian to be the second most popular figure. He was the second most popular figure after Nasrallah. So this is all this investment of Iran to the soft power. That's the only state that stands up to the Israelis, to Israel, when at the same time the Arab rulers had sold off the Palestinian cause. This is the Iranian saying. So all this brings a lot of support in the Arab streets, in the Muslim masses to the Iranians, which is very important, because with such a strategy, the Iranians transcend the sectarian divide. So they see not the Iranians as Shias, they see them as a Muslim power that stands up to the honor of the Muslim world, which is the Palestinian issue. Once I spoke with a refugee from Afghanistan, and he told me his awful experiences during his stay in Iran, that it was not good at all. But he admitted one thing. He admitted that at least the Iranians are standing up to the Israelis and are supporting truly the Palestinians. So this saying from a simple man, from a refugee, is the whole policy of the Iranians. They try to cultivate the soft power. They know that only through the Palestinian issue they can transcend this divide, the sectarian divide.
Professor, did this statement of Ahmadinejad was painful for the Jewish in Israel?
It only served to corroborate Israeli official line that the Iranian government is bent on a genocide against Jews, right? It didn't really help any matters in that sense, right? But I think that Alexis said Ahmadinejad was a passing figure. There is an anti-Semitic strand in Iranian politics and culture. One cannot disregard it, but there's anti-Semitic trends in the United States and in Great Britain, right? So we should give the Iranians a break. And, Iranian Jews live in Iran, as I think we mentioned this in our talk yesterday. Yes. They live in Iran. They are free to go as they will, but they don't feel like going. They feel that they're Iranian. They are better off. They are economically well. Again, they're free to go, but they choose to remain in Iran. I think that's one example that Iran is not such a bad place even for its Jews, Right.
When I was in Iran, I visited the Jewish hospital. Actually, there. So, yes, of course. So also, I mean, any Iranian can go, and any foreigner that needs the services of the hospital can go there. So actually, I did have this kind of feeling that I cannot go to synagogue, I cannot meet an Iranian Jewish or something like this. From the other perspective, it was clear from Iranians, it's another Abrahamic religion. This is from where all the other two religions they came out. So there was a kind of respect. But what I can say is that even if there is some anti-Semitism that exists everywhere, there is no systemic anti-Semitism that it used to be in Central Europe, or sometimes we see it in the United States. Generally, there is a kind of security being a Jew in Iran after the Islamic Revolution.
Well, the most interesting thing about the Islamic Revolution is that, and again, it's a colleague of mine just published a book on it, and he had showed that during the Islamic Revolution, apropos you mentioned Sapir Hospital, the Jewish hospital. The Jewish hospital in Tehran was the only hospital to which casualties...
Yes, after in 78 and 79, the demonstrations against Shah, actually, in one of the squares in Tehran, that was the biggest demonstrations. Actually, it was the one that cured all the incidents that happened those days. And even after the Islamic Revolution, they opened up the doors in order to help the people.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think it was funded and it was supported by the state and by the support of one of the Ayatollah that I don't remember his name now.
Right. Absolutely. And there were several Jews who also participated in the revolutionary movement itself, too.
Yes, they supported it. They supported it. Yes.
Yeah, it's because Khomeini as well promised that he will protect the Jews of Iran, that they are a historical part of the Iranian nation. That the Iranian Jews used to be the biggest Jew minority in the Middle East. But now they are approximately 20,000 now.
20, some people say 30 even.
Even Iranian officials say they do not exceed 20,000. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif told that they do not exceed the 20,000, but they used to be 80,000 or 60,000.
There were 80,000 before the revolution.
Yeah, there were 80,000. In 1979. Right. So many less.
So I would like to thank both of you for this amazing talk. Actually, we enjoyed it very much, and actually we have a lot of also questions I received on my email as well. A lot of questions. A lot of the questions they've been said, they were coming from our audience, and I'm very glad, Professor, that you join us from Israel. We're going to have the chance to see us soon. I hope when you visit Cyprus, we can have a coffee. It will be my pleasure.
I love Cyprus. I've been there so many times, and the next time I'm able, I will get in touch with you, and we'll catch up on things.
Yes, of course, it will be a pleasure. Alexis, thank you very much for once again participating in our talk. Always having you, Alexis, we are learning more and more. Actually, we have to see that we have a very good book from Professor Haggai. It came the intensification on Palestine. It came out on 2020. Actually, I got it today from Amazon.
Wow.
Yeah, recent book. So I believe that it's a very good opportunity to learn more about Israel and Palestine. And also we are going to read soon, but it's only in Greek, the article of Alexis about Soleimani. He make a very good research. So we're also waiting for that. I would like very much to thank you, both of you, for being with us tonight. It was a pleasure. I would like to thank all of our audience that was following us, sending questions and participating with us tonight. Next week, we're going to be with you at 9 o'clock again, and another Israeli that is living in the United States, Tomer Israeli, is going to talk to us about anti-terrorism and about martial tactics in army. We have this specific audience as well, so I believe that is going to be very interesting. for the Greek people that they are busy in the strategy and in the methodology of war to follow us. So thank you very much for tonight, and see us in the near future. Goodbye and good night.
Nice to meet you, Alexis. It was fun.
Nice to meet you, Professor Ram.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.